Well, welcome back to Media Apocalypse, our series about threats facing journalism, news gathering, and the flow of information on matters of public concern in our democracy, and dedicated to exploring solutions, both legal and otherwise, for preserving the press function. We are thrilled to have Rasmus Nielsen back with us today. Professor Nielsen is Professor of Political Communication and Director at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford. Now, in our last episode, we left off with the Reuters 2019 report entitled, "What Can Be Done? Digital Media Policy Options for Europe and Beyond." And now that report, of which, of course, Professor Nielsen was one of the main authors, mentions three factors crucial for the health of digital media in Europe. And the three F's: freedom, funding, and the future. Press freedom, protecting journalists and media from the threats to their independence and to freedom of expression. Funding, obviously leveling the playing field and support for sustainable news gathering. And finally, the future, orienting towards digital, mobile, and platform-dominated future that people are demonstrably embracing. Now, I want to start off our talk with the softball question. Were you right?
I mean, we've just published our 2020 Reuters Institute Digital News Report, where we look at news and media use across 40 different markets on 6 continents. I mean, I think what we see is that the move to a more digital and a more mobile and a more platform-dominated environment continues apace. Television is still important for older people. There are still some who read print in addition to using other platforms. But in most countries, the number of people who rely on digital media, who prefer the smartphone as sort of the remote control to much of their life, and who use often quite a bewildering array of different platforms for lots of different things, including finding and accessing and discussing and sharing news, continues to increase. And this is clear overall. Of course, most people do lots of different things online, but when we ask the sort of follow-up question, what is the most important way in which, the main way in which you find news online? Across these 40 markets, it's less than 1 in 3 who say that going directly to a news site or an app is their main way of getting news, and the vast majority rely on different kinds of platforms, search, social, and for some aggregators. And when we turn from the top line finding there and look at the 18 to 24-year-olds, the numbers are even more pronounced. It's just 16% who say that going direct to a news site or app is their main way of getting online news, and a much larger number rely on social and other platforms. So we find low trust in news that they find via social media in particular, a bit higher in search, but not as high as in established news organizations. They're also quite concerned about Facebook in particular, but also WhatsApp and YouTube to some extent as potential platforms for misinformation. But there is no evidence in our work that this has impacted whether people use them. Use is high and stable for the established platforms, and growing for several new entrants, both some that are owned by the large incumbents as well as some that are owned by others, including mainly Chinese conglomerates. And the same applies for news. These platforms and services are very, very widely used, in particular by younger people, in particular by people with lower levels of formal education and people with lower levels of income, as ways in which they access and find online news.
Do you think that the use of social media platforms to find news is driving lower trust among younger people for traditional news gathering organizations?
It's hard to imagine that the reliance on platforms where lots of different things are sort of bundled and sometimes sort of bundled together and sometimes perhaps mixed up, and where people often don't recognize or remember the brand of the provider behind them. It's hard to imagine that it has no role. I would say that so far we haven't really seen any strong evidence that there is a direct causal link. And I think a sort of a simple way to think of it is that when we look across the 40 markets that we look at, almost everywhere social media are widely used. So in that sense, that's sort of a global phenomenon. But trust in news is very varied from country to country. There are a number of countries in Northern Europe in particular where it's a clear majority who say they trust the news, and then many markets across the world, often more polarized with sort of very partisan politics, very divisive, sort of diverse and divided societies where trust is much lower. And in all those countries, people use social media. So it's hard to sort of not suspect that there is a link, but it's not one we have found direct evidence for at this stage.
What would you say was the most surprising finding that you wrote about in your 2020 report?
I think one thing in particular that stood out for me is that while I think in many countries, many of us see the world becoming more polarized and more divided around political issues, but also around sort of questions of values or priorities that go beyond just partisan politics, whether it's climate change or LGBT rights or issues of racism and other forms of structural inequality. I think it's sort of quite noteworthy that when we ask people about whether they prefer news that express a point of view, their own point of view potentially, or for that matter, that challenges the point of view, or that news that advance no particular point of view, a silent majority in every country, almost every country, say that they prefer news with no point of view. Now, I think that was quite surprising. I mean, I think sometimes it's easy for someone like myself, who sort of spends quite a lot of time following political news and also spends quite a lot of time on Twitter with lots of other people who follow political news and often have quite strong views, to assume that everyone is very engaged and also perhaps very divided, and tend to navigate public life, at least in part, in very partisan heuristics. But it's not clear that that's the case with news. And lots of people are still both saying that they prefer news with no particular point of view, but also in practice, when we then look at their behavior in the US, for example, it often means that they are using, say, local television, the website of a local newspaper, large portals like MSN or Yahoo News that are purveyors of sort of journalism that you can either say is sort of impartial, or critics might call it sort of he said, she said, and centrist and anodyne. But I think we can sort of recognize that it's quite different from more strident publications like Fox News or Occupy Democrats.
Thanks a lot. I'm going to switch over to Sandy.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Rasmus. Rasmus, I want to drag you back a bit to your older report, and something I actually think is timely, if I'm connecting the dots correctly, with the EU having asked for public comments on the Digital Services Act package. And that is, in your report, you and your colleagues note that the European Union is increasingly emerging as what you call the global policy entrepreneur on digital issues, with influence that resounds far afield, and that is consistent with the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Opinion and Expression, David Kay, who's pretty much said the same thing, indicating that regulation of online content through competition and data protection policies, he says Europe will de facto regulate the global internet. I think certainly in the area of data privacy, people who are likely to be looking at these video casts and indeed across the United States are not unfamiliar with the GDPR and its influence in the States. But I did think it would be important to get you to articulate the other ways and the other issues where you think the EU is likely to rule the web.
I mean, I think there are a number of countries around the world who are, looking at the sort of status quo in the digital media environment, and I think they sort of, see the benefits that digital technologies have brought, but also increasingly concerned about the negative consequences. In some cases, collateral damage from the success of some companies, but more worryingly, perhaps, the sort of negative externalities of some of the ways in which some of the larger platforms operate, as well as issues around the concentration of power in different walks of life. And I think governments are, wondering whether they want that status quo to continue, and are looking for options. And right now, I think the way that Wendy Hall, a British academic who I think has been very influential in this, sort of articulates it, is she says that right now there are sort of two clear visions of the internet available. There is sort of the quite sort of combination of libertarian and sort of national security state that you see in the United States on the one hand, and then on the other hand you have the sort of idea of a sovereign internet as articulated by mainland China and to some extent by Russia. And I think a lot of countries are looking at those two and saying, well, we're not necessarily going to go the way of mainland China or Russia, but we are not particularly interested in just letting the sort of libertarian national security state approach continue either. So what are the other options? And I think that's where Brussels and some of the individual member states have been entrepreneurs. And this is in many different areas. You mentioned privacy and data protection. That's certainly one. You have the, I think, very influential work around, the action plan on misinformation, where it's been, I think, rightly criticized by some for sort of being sort of quite convoluted and complex in places. But it's also, I think, worth recognizing that when you look at what other governments are doing around the world, those who are not interested in sort of resorting to content regulation are quite inspired by it. So the Australian, our government is just now looking at doing a code of practice the way that the EU has instituted with the sector. You have areas like competition, where the Khmer report that was delivered to Commissioner Vestager and her very ambitious and aggressive sort of driving on the competition antitrust agenda, I think is resonating across the world. We've seen again the ACCC in Australia do similar work. We've seen the Stiegler Center at Chicago do sort of essentially a sort of an informal version of the Khmer report in a US where there's been no sort of federal government interest in looking at that particular issue. So I think in the area of competition, we see similar things. And then we have also, I think more broadly, though we'll see where it ends up, and I think it perhaps a bit more ambiguously, the wider discussion around what some prefer to call online harms, sort of things that are not illegal, but are potentially harmful, where some politicians feel that greater obligation should be put on private companies to police things that are not illegal or face consequences of various sorts. That wider discussion is also, I think, driven in some parts of Europe, and we see governments across the world take notice of those sort of policy instruments being offered. From the point of view of the companies, I think they'll all say that they will sort of comply with the letter of the law in the jurisdictions where they operate, and of course, we should sort of, would expect them to do that, and if they don't, there'll be consequences to that. From a practical point of view, in particular in smaller countries, the easiest thing to do in most cases will be to have a single sort of near universal approach. And the practical decision will often be to sort of build that around one or a few of the bigger markets. And of course, the two biggest by revenue are the US and Europe. So I wouldn't be surprised if a number of countries around the world would be sort of effectively offered a choice. Do you want your version of platform X to be, the US version or the European version in your local jurisdiction? And then you can sort of get that. But whether every country, in particular smaller countries, less affluent countries, are really realistically going to be able to, or even want to, try to sort of dictate their own terms to the large technology companies on every issue under the sun, that seems less likely, if you will.
Yeah, no, I follow you. I'm particularly interested, though, if you wouldn't mind focusing just a touch on the use of competition laws. In reading the report, you put out a number of proposals with respect to a number of issues, and I keep coming back as I read it to competition laws that would ensure a level playing field, as you put it, and more competitive digital market. And I believe that's what the EU is looking at right now. Considering what I see as the dire circumstances newspaper operations, at least in the US, have, do you see any means in the short run for newspaper operations to get a better foot?
Well, I mean, this is a sort of a pretty
Respect to level that playing field, be meaningful, and save them?
I mean, I'm going to be honest on this. I mean, I think there are very different views on both the how realistic and how desirable different interventions are in this space, and how much of a difference they're likely to make for news in particular. I suppose that my personal interpretation is that there are a number of parts of the digital economy where we have extremely high levels of market concentration and very real risks of abuse of that dominant position, and where I'm glad that competition authorities are looking more closely at how more proactive enforcement, consideration of data network effects in scrutinizing mergers and acquisitions, possible requirements of interoperability and data transfer for dominant players, and a number of, as well as dedicated authorities to monitor and track developments in this sector, including with greater investigative powers to really understand the marketplace to a greater extent than I think is possible, as well as a sort of greater emphasis on trying to sort of act proactively and early, rather than have the sort of the tendency to have sort of cases decided 10 years after the fact, where the consequences are sort of pretty much sort of, by then sort of have bedded in. I think all of that is quite promising from a competition point of view. I would say that I think from the point of view of publishers, it's worth remembering that the point of view of competition enforcement historically is to protect competition, not competitors. And that in the wider sort of digital economy, it seems to me that the entities that are most likely to benefit from tougher competition enforcement in the digital economy are those that already are most successful at competing with the dominant platforms. And those players are other platforms. They're just platforms that are slightly smaller or owned by other companies or are other parts of other very large companies. And I think that's probably a good thing to have more competition in that space. But I think it's sort of quite important when we think about the news industry particularly, that in a world in which from country to country, ComScore data suggests that all news and information providers combined account for sort of somewhere in between sort of 3 and 6% of the time that people spend online. Even with much tougher competition enforcement in, for example, the advertising space, or for that matter, around issues of data access from users on dominant platforms, it's not obvious to me that this would have a transformative impact on the business prospects of news in particular, if the entire sector is not much larger than a single one of the smaller platform competitors already well poised to benefit from any interventions like that. So I would say, sort of broadly speaking, welcome, but I wouldn't sort of bet my farm on it sort of transforming the prospects of the news industry particularly.
Thank you very much. RonNell.
Yeah, Rasmus, thanks for being with us again. I wanted to pivot a little and ask you about the 2020 report's findings on the partisan divide in the US, and particularly how that maps onto some of the important questions that we've been asking here about the press as a democratic institution. Your report tells us that the US is even more polarized than a lot of our peer nations, with right-leaning citizens sort of having very different views about the press than left-leaning ones. And most striking to me, I think, was that 43% of right-leaning Americans pointed to journalists as the most concerning source of misinformation. So I'm interested broadly in your thoughts about what factors make the US unique among even its arguably politically polarized peer nations in the wideness of this left-right gap. But more specifically, I guess I'm interested in how all of this maps onto the finding that you were discussing at the beginning with Scott, that a majority of people say that they prefer news with no point of view. Do they maybe not mean that? And what do we do with a population that purports to want neutrality, but in fact wants partisanship?
I mean, in some ways, I think this is sort of, a much bigger discussion for sociologists and political scientists and historians to sort of help us untangle. And I wouldn't want to speak out of turn and purport to be an expert on sort of all parts of this. I suppose a sort of a way in which I try to think about this in relatively simple terms is to sort of to posit that what we have in the US is a society in which you have at the same time, increased partisan polarization that's been a bit asymmetrical at the elite level, with the Republican Party moving much farther to the right than the Democratic Party has moved to the left. And considerable partisan polarization at the level of the mass public, but that is, I think, in part tied into new ways of sort of in which we sort of live and sort ourselves in our daily lives, where more and more people don't really have cross-cutting social ties, because they sort of tend to work with, live with, and sort of socialize with people who sort of pretty much like themselves in many ways, by education, income, but also politically. And in that sense, people are sort of perhaps less confronted with, if you will, the humanity of people that they don't necessarily agree with, or for that matter, that are different from them in other ways. I think the way it plays out is that you have, on the one hand, you have a sort of a growing partisan divide amongst those who are very committed on these issues, both politically, but also on some of the values issues that that I mentioned before, whether it's, again, sort of climate change or issues around gender and sexuality, or for that matter, abortion, and of course issues of racial justice. But also, I think it's worth remembering that a lot of people, while they may have sort of fairly sort of stable belief systems and also vote pretty consistently from one party or the other, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are sort of highly engaged and animated partisans in all aspects of their lives, or think of themselves that way. And they may think of themselves more through their identity as being, husbands and fathers and colleagues and football fans and whatnot, and locals to a particular area, than through the lens of their political identity or their stances on some of the big issues that divide the country. In very simple terms, when we ask Americans not about their voting behavior, but about whether they think of themselves as being on the left, in the center, or on the right, it's about half who say that they're in the center, and then about a quarter on the left and a quarter on the right. Now, a lot of the people in the center may vote very consistently for one party or the other, but that's not the way they think of themselves. And when we look at their media use, sure, some of them do watch Fox News or follow Occupy Democrats, or similar sort of very left-leaning outlets. But quite a lot of them are, first of all, not using very much news in the first place, and secondly, again, are using sort of fairly sort of centrist sources like their local TV station or local newspaper online, or big aggregators and the like. So I think it is a situation in which, again, it comes back a bit to the sort of, I mean, I know that the term silent majority has a particular history in the US, and that's not what I mean to suggest by the term. But I think it's sometimes worth remembering that even as many of us disagree very strongly about many things, there are also just a lot of people who are getting on with their life and are not actually at this moment thinking about the latest Supreme Court decision, or what the president said yesterday, or what the Democratic Party said about something. They have bills to pay, they have children that they care about, parents that they worry about, towns that they live in, and I don't want to sort of romanticize that. I think there can be sort of somewhat sort of an inwards migration sometimes from big issues confronting our societies. But on the other hand, I can't stress enough how dangerous it is for those of us who sometimes may be tempted to assume that everyone is like us, or even worse, that everyone is like us on Twitter, which is like the worst possible guide probably to sort of the wider state of society that one can think of. And I just think we need to keep that in mind.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that makes me want to segue into asking you about another stark divide that the 2020 report describes about Americans, which was almost as staggering to me as the partisan divide that you report. You found in the report an increase in people who say they are paying for news. So something like 20% of people in the US say they're paying for news online in some form, usually those sort of upmarket national titles. And you found that at least some of them say that they're doing so sort of on the matter of principle, right? That their motivator is support for the mission of good journalism, that they think we should have it and that it should be done well and that they should fund it. But staggeringly to me, something like 40% of people in America say nothing would persuade them to pay for news. And I just want to sort of give you the chance to describe for us what you think is behind that finding and whether you think that's a movable position. And if it's not a movable position, then what kinds of consequences do you think it has for groups like ours that are thinking really critically about how to preserve the press function and serve that silent majority that you're describing who are seeking accurate, thoughtful news from sort of transpartisan gatekeepers of information on matters of public concern?
I mean, I think there's sort of two ways to think about the 40% of people who currently not paying for online news, who say that nothing will make them pay for online news in the future. One is sort of through the lens of economics, and the other one would be sort of through the lens of sort of broadly speaking sociology. I mean, I think through the lens of economics, I mean, this is an eminently rational position. You know, as a consumer, you've paid for your phone, you've paid for your, you know, internet connectivity. You go online, there is a near infinite number of websites in the world that you can spend your time with. Many of them provide news. The majority of those who provide news provide it free at the point of consumption. You know, the news that you get for free may not be the best possible news, but it's probably pretty satisfying from the point of view of your day-to-day informational needs. You know, why on earth would you pay? And just from a sort of a classic sort of econ 101 point of view, you know, in a competitive marketplace, and if there's anything we know about, you know, the internet as an information marketplace, it's very competitive. We should expect the marginal cost to approximate the marginal cost of serving one additional consumer, and that cost is indistinguishable from zero online. So in that sense, it's not surprising that most news is available for free, and that lots of people who are not necessarily super interested in news are perfectly content with the news that they can get for free, much of which comes from wire agencies and the like, which are perfectly decent sources of information for many purposes. That's the lens of economics, right? I mean, in that sense, I think this is sort of rational consumer behavior in a way. I think there is, and that, I mean, you know, can we move the needle on that? You know, we are moving the needle on that, and I think it's worth recognizing that while the numbers we're seeing are not sort of quote unquote replacing the money that newspapers made in the fundamentally different pre-digital marketplace, which it never will, while the number's not replacing that, you know, not so long ago, people were saying that no one would ever pay for digital news. And the fact that anyone is paying for any digital news, I think, is a real testament to the outstanding quality and value of some forms of journalism. And the people who do that journalism and the people who have, you know, has stewarded those companies and make them run should be incredibly proud that millions of people are now paying for a better version of something they have a near infinite supply of for free on the internet. Can we do better in that? I think there is a lot of room for improvement in the execution and whatnot, but I think we need to remain realistic. I think it'll be for the foreseeable future a significant but relatively small minority of people who will pay for news. And even amongst those people, the vast majority of the news consumption will be free at the point of consumption, as it is for me. And I'm a news lover if there ever was one, as well as very privileged in terms of my affluence and whatnot. Then I think there is the other side of it, which is sort of crudely put called sociological, which is, I mean, to sort of briefly rely again on the terminology of economics, but I mean, news is an experience good. We know whether we value it once we've consumed it. So a lot of this is about, you know, what do we expect, and what have we been sort of socialized to expect, and what are the sort of the cultural toolkits we draw on to make the decisions about whether we want to pay when we encounter a paywall on an internet in which almost everything else is free, and where we're already probably paying for Spotify and Netflix, which we, you know, enjoy a lot and may not immediately think that spending 15 minutes with a news outlet every day would merit the same price point as Netflix or Spotify or something like it. From a cultural point of view and a sort of a sociological point of view, I'd say that in a society in which only about a third of the population say they trust news, and where in the past we've found that very large numbers of people say that they don't feel that the news help them understand the world around them. I mean, if that's the low opinion that people have of news, it's not surprising they're not going to pay for it. And of course, it gets worse in some ways. I mean, this is by now 3 years ago, but there are very significant minorities in America. From memory, about something like a third, it might be a bit different from that, this is just from memory, who say that they feel that the news is subject to undue political influences, and a similar number who say they feel that the news is subject to undue commercial influences. If people don't trust news, if they don't feel that it helps them understand the world, and if they think that the news is in cahoots with political or commercial elites that don't have the public's best interest at heart, I mean, try charging for that. In that sense, there is a sort of a pretty profound crisis of confidence and a sort of a erosion of a public connection. Now, I want to be very, very clear, and I think this is particularly important to be explicit about this at a moment like this in time, that we shouldn't romanticize a world in which people have high trust and strong sort of confidence in the operations of institutions, unless we can establish that that trust is well placed and that confidence is merited. And if I look back and sort of think about the sort of say early 60s in the United States, which I think sometimes some people maybe tend to romanticize a little bit, I'm not immediately convinced that I would sort of think that women, people of color, African Americans, sexual minorities, who sort of looked at American journalism at that time was right to trust it. Actually, to be perfectly honest, I mean, I would have a lot of sympathy if they were like, you know what, this is not for us. This is sort of journalism by white men, for white men, and about white men. So in that sense, I don't think we should sort of romanticize a strong public connection or high trust in itself, unless we think that what people have that trust in and appreciate, in fact, might help them live the lives they want to lead, and make more informed choices based on their own values. Now, I personally happen to believe that the best available research suggests that with its many imperfections, that independent professional journalism can in fact do that. And we have a pretty copious amounts of research from around the world suggesting that. So in that sense, I think people could have confidence in journalism, but I would also say I understand when they don't. I mean, there is a lot of stuff where you can sort of look at it and say, well, that's very nice, but would I trust that or would I pay for that? Maybe not.
Thanks, that's super helpful.
Jack.
Yes, Rasmus, this follows up beautifully on your last answer, and I wanted to go back to the questions we discussed the last time you were on our program. Here's a way of drawing out the consequences of what you just said. One, it's likely that the news organizations do not serve well lots of different parts of society, and you mentioned sexual orientation minorities, racial and ethnic minorities, also probably ideological minorities too. And as we go from country to country, the different mix of the different kinds of minorities that would be involved would change. But your general point is that there's no reason to believe that the current system is serving them well. That was the first point you made. The second point you made was that there is lack of trust in news organizations, and partly that might be because of the gap between what is delivered and what is received, and partly it might be for other reasons. Then you also said that most people don't want to pay for news. And again, that might be for economic reasons, but it also might be for reasons of trust. So the question I wanted to ask you was, can you think of any reforms that would help increase trust by ensuring that there's a larger supply of news that different minority groups, ideological, ethnic, religious, and so forth, would actually want to see and consume, right? Are there any such reforms? And then that's going to lead back to the economic question, which is, given the fact that there are strong economic reasons for most people to free ride on the production of news and the consumption paying for by others, is there any reason to believe that the very groups that you feel are underserved would be interested in paying for this particular form of news? That is, I'm trying to combine these two very important points you made. One is about the economics, and the other is about the lack of connection between elite news and the actual audiences.
Well, I mean, first of all, I want to recognize that I think we are seeing a really a much sort of more pronounced conviction in parts of the journalistic profession that there are more than one way, and that there is more than one way in which you can be a bloody good journalist and do really good journalism, and that we don't need to sort of converge on a sort of a single idealized form of sort of high-minded, and quite sort of often quite sort of intellectually, self-involved and perhaps demanding form of sort of journalism that we might associate with news organizations that I personally appreciate and really respect and enjoy a lot, but that aren't right for everybody. I mean, I remember very vividly a good friend of mine in New York used to teach a first-year undergraduate course at Quinney for incoming freshmen, and he required them all to read the New York Times every day. And I have profound respect for the New York Times. I want to stress that. But I would also say that what I learned from him very strikingly was how many people from New York itself, lifelong New York residents, who only in that class came to realize that, as one of his students put it, that people like me could read the New York Times. But we're still often quite off-put by, say, the New York Times definition of news you can use, where can you go in the Hamptons, or what kind of sort of Caribbean getaway can you get on, or for that matter, the ads, the products that, he or she might never be able to afford in their lifetime. And I think there is now, both around the sort of discussion right now, critical and uncomfortable discussion, but I think also necessary discussion around, what are the ideals? And I think the plural of ideal there is important in journalism, that can allow different forms of excellence, and do they converge or are they diverse? And I think that's important. And I think we are seeing journalists, from the founders of the 19th or the MLK project or others, embrace the idea that you can sort of start from a community you want to serve and a point of view and do excellent journalism at the same time. You don't want to need to embrace the view from nowhere. Now, I hope that in the future that will, in addition to very important dimensions around gender and race, that there will also be sort of similar, explicit journalistic ambitions to think about, what does sort of high quality news look from the point of view of people who are poor, and sometimes are white and poor. What does that look like? And I'm glad to say that of course, this historically was what, for example, the Daily News in New York was offering, and they still have, they've moved their offices, but I still love their what was carved in the building in Midtown that they used to occupy. God must have loved the common man since he made so many of them. There is a sexist undertone to that, of course, but fundamentally, I think the ethos is a strain of thinking of sort of a proudly self-consciously working class form of journalism that still exists in some countries, and that is also a contribution to these questions of diversity. So in that sense, I just want to say I think we're seeing more and more journalists who are sort of respectful of what some organizations are trying to achieve, but not thinking it's the right thing for them or the only thing that's worth trying to achieve, and are more proudly trying to serve particular audiences who have particular lived experiences and needs that overlap, but only partly with what a wider public might want. And I think that is probably the most promising, is to start from the people who are trying to do the journalism and the people that are trying to do it for, rather than to try to think about this primarily as a public policy problem. I think our history is sort of littered with examples of sort of people who wanted to do well for other people without necessarily understanding their needs or what the sort of practicalities of it might look like very well. That said, are there things we can think about? Yes, I think there are. I mean, in Europe, in addition to the very important role played by popular newspapers that elites like to poo-poo, but that are incredibly important for the sort of the breadth and diversity of news consumption in many countries still, Bild in Germany, the Mirror and the Sun in the UK and their counterparts elsewhere. In addition to that, public service media have been absolutely essential for ensuring broad shared news provision, also for communities that aren't, going to pay for or pick up upmarket newspapers or their digital equivalents. Public service media continue to play that role and are required to. I mean, this is part of the incentive structure and the governance structure of those organizations. There are some sort of challenges around that in the sense that they sort of tend to remain broadcast organizations rather than digitally focused, and thus, without necessarily wanting to, they in practice end up becoming yet another way of taking money from everybody and giving it to old people who watch TV. So there are some sort of challenges to that model, but the fundamental model has a very universalist ethos that recognizes both sort of commonality and diversity and tries to deliver on that. And we can show it works. I mean, there is research to show that this type of intervention, while costly, also help ensure both a more informed, but equally importantly, a more equally informed public, including groups that are poorly served by many commercial media. In terms of other things that I think policymakers could consider that might make a difference in this space, I think is, I'm on the record, and we've also talked in this program about the fact that there are policy tools available should policymakers decide that they do in fact want to not just give nice after dinner speeches about the importance of journalism, but also do something to try to create a more enabling environment for professional journalism. I think one thing that's important to sort of think about in that context is, if we look at the subset of countries where some form of support might be put in place, to just sort of think a little bit about, what is the social profile going to be of these forms of support? Are they primarily supporting an even greater provision of even better quality news to the small minority of people who are already paying? I mean, e.g., am I going to get tax, breaks, so that I can, keep more of the vast amounts of money that I'm already paid while enjoying great journalism at, other taxpayers' expense? Which is not necessarily terrible, but we have, if we make that intervention, we have to do it with open eyes, or other forms of intervention that are more targeted. And in the latter space, I mean, there are examples of that. In Sweden, for example, the direct subsidies that are offered for some forms of independent journalism are targeted to increasing diversity of provision in markets that may have only one provider. Rather than just willy-nilly spreading the money to everybody, or just essentially offering sort of general direct and indirect subsidies that reward the already successful. I don't think any of these things are sort of magic wands. We live in deeply unequal societies where people are very different and very different values and interests, and I don't think we can make that go away with public policy. But we can think about the social inequalities that policy interventions may either exacerbate or address. And sometimes we will make interventions that we know full well may exacerbate social inequalities if we believe that the intrinsic value of what they enable is great enough that it might still be merited. I mean, this is why we support, say, high culture, right? I mean, no one's sane and reality-based is under any illusion that the public money that's spent on supporting high arts is sort of democratically, universally inclusive. But many societies have come to the view that it is a good thing that there are high arts, and thus willing to commit some resource to supporting it, even if the people who enjoy the high arts are often people who are very privileged and in principle could probably pay their own way if that was deemed necessary. So I think it's important we think about this. I think there are some options, but I suppose that at a fundamental level, I think more than anything, it's important that journalists, and I think many of them are, and I really respect that, really try to think about the part of their professional, sort of timeless professional ambitions that isn't only about seeking truth and reporting it, but is also about doing it for the whole public and not just for those who are most like most journalists.
This, of course, another way of making the same point in a slightly different way. if we are urging journalists to serve the whole public and not just simply an elite public, we have to create a situation in which a journalist can earn a living doing so. So that's the reason why the question of public policy arises. You see, if the claim were merely, we really should just allow communities to find journalists and journalists to find communities, and then they'll produce what the communities need. Well, if that were the case, this would already have happened, right? But we know, in fact, that because of economic dislocations caused by the digital age, in fact, it hasn't happened. If anything, the problem has gotten worse. So the question is really the question of intervention. And that raises another interesting possibility, which I was interested in you exploring. The pre-digital solution to the problem of serving communities was geographical. That is to say, you try to divide up the space into ever smaller parts and make sure that there were multiple newspapers, or at least one newspaper or one media source that was serving a particular community. And so it was a geographical solution to the problem of diversity. But now, of course, the fact of the digital age means that you can actually agglomerate or accumulate people from a particular group, religious group, for example, or ethnic group, in ways that you couldn't do before, because in fact, even if they're spread out widely over a geographical area, they may all have common interests. And so it's possible through the digital age to agglomerate in ways that was never possible before. Now, the question I wanted to ask you is whether or not that offers an opportunity. And if so, has anybody tried to make use of that opportunity?
I mean, I think we are seeing some of what you describe. One way to think of it is sort of a move from sort of geographic communities to communities of interest or communities of identity. And since the sort of the economics of news production often are primarily about, critical mass, do you have a commercial critical mass that can sort of cover your fixed costs? And in one media market, you could sustain, black newspapers in a number of American cities, then the economic grew more punishing, and while the black communities grew, the newspapers faded away or shrunk to shadow their former selves. But in a different media environment, it's possible, at least in principle, to try to collect that community or gather that community at a national scale rather than in every city with the fixed cost of freight in a different way. I think we are seeing some of that. We are seeing, I think, a sort of a general move in many different parts of the digital environment, but also when it comes to news, where the famous long tail, its sort of exact physical dimensions was rather more dramatically big head and thin long tail than was initially suggested by various sort of optimistic looking graphs. But I think we are seeing a tendency in a direction where more and more individuals are trying to identify a single community and work with and for them, rather than try to create a sort of a mass media that's sort of everybody in a particular geography or even at a national level. And the economics of that are very different. If you're talking about a single or a few people doing something because they really believe in it and they think that they can find people who value it and are willing to support it, we're talking about something that VCs and other people who are interested in blitz scaling and other fancy things would dismiss as a lifestyle business or a nonprofit hobby. But if that's the kind of journalism that you want to do, then that is possible and in some ways easier than it was in the past to do. And I think we are seeing entrepreneurs, civic entrepreneurs, do that, not because they want to grow rich off of doing it, but because they believe in doing it and just need to make a living while doing it. I'm not suggesting that this will generate 70,000 individual news entrepreneurs across the country in a way that will in a harmonious way reflect Americans' demography, political and cultural divides. But I think it is in some ways encouraging to just remember that this is sort of possible, and we are seeing some people do it. And in terms of what you say about the intervention, I mean, I see what you mean, that it's sort of we shouldn't sort of succumb to voluntarism and just sort of assume that if only people try to do these things, it could happen. Some things are structurally hard or impossible, and serving underprivileged communities, and especially truly disadvantaged communities, in a way that are sort of sustainable on a pure commercial basis is harder than most, if anything. That said, I think we also need to recognize that solving any problem starts with recognizing that it is a problem, and picking this as the problem that you want to solve. And without sort of, we shouldn't overly generalize, but I would say I think the last couple of years have suggested that the consciousness in the wider American journalism of how the profession and the industry has perhaps not been proactive enough in trying to address the sort of wider diversity of publics that exist in the US. That consciousness is greater than it's been in recent years. And there are more journalists, not all journalists, but more journalists and more editors who are looking at this and saying, you know what, I'm going to make this my problem. Other people can have the other problem of how do we make sure that people in the Upper West Side have great journalism from now till kingdom come, but I'm going to pick this as my problem. And this is the problem where I'm going to try to shoot the arrow a bit further than others have done. And, is that going to make the problem go away? No. But I think on balance, if more people are trying, we're going to get a better result.
Well, can I just end the conversation just with one question following up on a comment you made to Sandy, and then which really follows up on a conversation we had in the last episode, which is that I had thought that the problem about funding was largely a supply problem, which is that their platform economics is such that you're going to get monopolies. The monopolies in the advertising industries are going to mean that the platforms are going to take a huge cut and therefore drain the revenue to the news organizations, which are trying to fund themselves through digital advertising. But the message I hear from you is that it's really a demand problem, not a supply problem, which is that people are just not that into the news. And that in an earlier age, if you wanted to read about sports or celebrities or the arts or whatever, you had to buy a newspaper. Here you don't have to do that. And so people are just bypassing news organizations because they're just not really that interested in it. I mean, am I getting it right?
I want to be very clear. I think the first problem you described, we have a version of that as well. It's sad as it is to admit, we sometimes have more than one problem, I suppose. The economics are very challenging on the supply side, the fact that the platforms, in particular the largest ones, are so successful at capturing our attention and consequently advertising. And also in some cases, competition authorities have found demonstrably abusing that position, as has been found by the European Commission in several cases against Google, for example, does not make any of this stuff easier. There's no question about that. But I think as challenging as that is, which is sort of one side of the problem, and this returns a bit to a sort of a trinity I used when we talked last about sort of provision, diversity, and reach, even the fact that provision and the economics of provision are very challenging and changing very rapidly right now, and are sort of made harder in some ways by the success and sometimes power of some of the larger platforms, I think does not in itself do away with the other problem, which is the problem of the public connection, for lack of a better term. And to take a very simple point in case, take the UK. The UK is home to the BBC, which I think I can say, sort of safely say, is one of the world's most respected and admired public service media organizations. Is also amongst its peers considered one of the more successful in terms of adapting to a digital reality, rather than being sort of stuck in a broadcast past. And it's one that every household in the UK is legally compelled under threat of criminal prosecution and potentially even jail sentences, are paying for more than £150 a year. So we're all contributing to it as well. So it's there, it's admired, it's admirable, it's, you know, generously funded. It does very good journalism and lots of it, and in many different forms. And despite that, when we look at online news consumption in the UK, it's less than half of people in the UK with internet access who use BBC News Online. They're all paying for it. Less than half of them bother to even use it on a weekly basis. That's not because they can't. They have internet access. They've already paid for it. It's because they find other things that are more compelling for them. And more broadly, when we look at how time is spent online in the UK, the BBC, which in radio is about 40% of listening in the UK, and in television, even in a very competitive multi-channel environment, is still about a third of linear scheduled television viewing. You know, the entirety of the BBC online is 1.5% of the time that people spend online. It's not because they can't. We can all in the UK go to the BBC News app or the iPlayer or other BBC online offerings, but we have many things to choose from, and we're not always choosing even the BBC. And I think that just underlines you know, how competitive that environment is in a commercial sense, but also from the point of view of really connecting with the public. And I can't stress enough how central I think is just both from the point of view of the sort of editorial ambitions of journalists, from the point of view of realizing the very real civic value that journalism can deliver to individuals in society at large, as well as to the sustainability of the business of news, but also the legitimacy of policy interventions like public service media, to recognize that journalism exists in the context of its audience. Without that connection with the public, there won't be any editorial impact, there won't be any civic value, and there won't be any sustainable business or sustainable political arrangement. And the platforms don't make any of this stuff easier, or much of it they don't make easier. But it's not obvious to me that we can sort of put it at their feet, that we have these other issues as well.
Well, the more we talk to you, the more we want to talk to you. But unfortunately, we have to stop now. Thank you so much for not only coming on today, but last time as well. We've learned a tremendous amount, and we're really, really grateful. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me again. Thank you.
Thanks, Rasmus.
Bye.